Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast. I'm your host, John Slick Baum. Here on the Aerospace Advantage podcast, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and subject matter experts to explore the intersection between strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. So if you like learning about aerospace power, you are in the right place. Now, to our regular listeners, thank you so much for coming back, and if it's your first time here, we really appreciate you joining us. Today, we're going to explore a topic that is getting a lot of attention here in DC, the relationship between the U.S. Space Force and the Air National Guard. The Guard has been executing space functions since the early 1990s, and I'm talking about day-to-day deployable space warfighting operations across numerous mission areas. They handle everything from space missile warning, satellite communications, space battle management, space surveillance and missile tracking, to space electronic warfare. In fact, the Air National Guard provides nearly 20% of the manpower and over 60% of the Space Force's warfighting capacity. So, when the Biden administration and the Office of Management and Budget decided to promote a single component Space Force with no reserve or Guard components, it left the question, what happens to the Air National Guard units handling space? One thing is for sure, we need to ensure the proper staffing of these billets because the demand of space is not going down. We also need to pay attention to the cost factors. Part-time folks don't cost as much as the full-time individuals. And we also need to make sure command authorities align. Right now, space folks in the Guard are in a weird command relationship. It would be like putting the Air Guard in the Navy. Space Guard folks need to report clearly and cleanly to the Space Force and Space Command. So with that, we're going to dig into this question and the relationships between the Guard, the Space Force, and before that, Air Force Space. And to help us understand this better, we have three space operators and commanders with us today. First, I'd like to introduce Col Michael Bruno, Chief of the Joint Staff, Colorado National Guard. Mike, welcome to the Aerospace Advantage.
Thanks, Slick. I appreciate the invitation.
Next, we have Lieutenant Colonel Scott McGuire, commander of the 114th Space Control Squadron of the Florida Air National Guard. Scott, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Blake. It's good to be here. I'm just proud to represent the 114th Thundercats and also the state of Florida. So thank you.
And finally, we have MySpace's own Senior Fellow Christopher Stone. Chris, it's great to have you back on the show. And as most of you know, Chris also serves in the Air Guard as a space operator.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
Well, Chris, let's kick off the conversation with you. Now, build the picture for us. What do space operators in the Guard do today?
Well, as you mentioned in your intro, there's pretty much not a whole lot that the Guard doesn't do in space operations. The Air National Guard has been engaged in space operations since the early 1990s, and it has grown into a representative of 7 different states in one territory in several mission areas. And so that's everything from missile warning, satellite communications, space battle management, space surveillance and missile tracking to space electronic warfare. And in fact, the Air National Guard currently provides about 20% of the manpower and over 60% of the Space Force's warfighting capacity. So this is not small things here. This is a good chunk of the capability that the Space Force currently has. And this started, as I mentioned, in the early 90s after the Cold War when the drawdown was going on. The Air Force was having a lot of limited billets in Air Force Space Command. They were looking for ways to maintain mission areas as well as potentially expand others. And because they didn't have the manpower authorizations and the funding to do so, they found that the National Guard was willing to take on some of these missions in addition to their more traditional flying missions. And so the first unit in Colorado became what is still the current only mobile missile warning asset there is in the U.S. military. And that has expanded, as I mentioned, into several other mission areas over time because of that and a lot of other reasons. So the cost-effective measure was one key area. The second thing was the experience base that you get from the National Guard members. A lot of these folks have 10-plus years of experience in their weapon system or their operational area. And as such, this kind of experience is really hard to come by in the active Space Force. And so when you have that kind of experience, and, oh, by the way, folks that work in the industry and in other parts of the space world, that gives you a lot of advantages in just know-how and knowledge that you can't get with just the active force, as effective and awesome as those folks are. And so as a result of that, with the limited budget constraints of today, the Air Force Space Command beforehand and the Space Force today has been a very big supporter of having the Air National Guard space units continue to take on more and to do more just because of their flexibility and their ability to do different things. And so with that's where we were and what they do currently.
Chris, thanks so much for the background. And let me ask you this. If I were executing a space mission in the Air Guard today, how would my unit report to the Space Force, given that the alignment doesn't look very direct? I mean, the head of the Air Guard falls under the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, not the Chief of Space Operations.
Yeah, that's correct. I know our two commanders here will probably give more detail at the tactical level, but at the highest level, as you mentioned, the Air National Guard is connected to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. It reports to there indirectly. Directly, it reports to the Chief of the National Guard Bureau per DoD policy. And as a result, all the Air Guard units, flying units, cyber units, whatever they are, they have the organizing, training, and equipping flows, funding, and whatnot from the federal side to the states to keep people mission ready and follow all those procedural training and everything else through the Air Force. Now, because of the Space Force being a service unto itself as of December 2019, all of these space units in the Air National Guard are, for all intents and purposes, orphaned from the organized, train, and equip chain. In order to keep the mission going, these units across the states and Guam, being the territory, are having to go through a series of memorandums of agreement and other sorts of hoops to jump through just to keep things ready to go. And while it's been able to continue their readiness, there have been several issues that have popped up from the standpoint of training, being able to ship equipment overseas, things of that sort, as well as getting people to have the orders cut in order to stay on shift for their 24/7 missions that the Guard supports. So I know we'll get into that more, but for now, because of that, the current Director of Space Operations for the National Guard Bureau does not have a direct OT&E line. And so these units are having to go roundabout ways through the Air Force to get to Space Operations Command and other things. And so it's totally inefficient and not very effective, especially as when you bring on new members in the Guard. Now the Space Force is starting to have their own basic training. They're starting to have their own training classes, and the specialty codes, 13S and 1 Charlie 6 as they're called, for the officer and enlisted are no longer Air Force things. They're now Space Force things. So that just creates all sorts of problems that shouldn't be because of what happened in the past.
Chris, thanks so much for that. And Mike, I want to build off what Chris was saying. Has continuing to operate in the Air National Guard created any issues for you as a commander in executing your space mission, or is it still business as usual? And I'm not saying that the Air Guard is bad by any means. What I think we're trying to talk about here is the fundamental force architecture that needs to be cleaned up given the stand-up of the Space Force.
Hey, Slick, that's a great question, and it's definitely not business as usual. So previously, my previous job, I was fortunate enough to be the commander of the 233rd Space Group here in Colorado. The 233rd has two operational squadrons. One, which Chris talked about earlier, the men and women of the 137th Space Warning Squadron. They operate the nation's only survivable and endurable base and missile warning and nuclear detonation detection capability. This is a one-of-a-kind mission, and it's only in the Air National Guard. We also operate the 138th Space Electromagnetic Warfare Squadron. They just changed their name, so I'm still getting used to that. Those members train and operate an offensive space control system in support of combatant commanders. These are space missions in an Air Force component. And under this current construct, there is truly an issue with the unity of command and the different operational philosophies between the two services and how they present their forces. Currently, the Air Force's mission is to fly, fight, and win, and their doctrine is driving towards developing multi-capable airmen who are proficient at accomplishing tasks outside their core specialties. That way they can provide combat and service support to an agile combat employment. U.S. Space Force's mission is to conduct global space operations. Their doctrine is based on a June 2020 Space Capstone publication, which creates a holistic and integrated view of how the space domain and space operations are done. And it directs mastery of space power disciplines of orbital warfare, space electromagnetic warfare, space battle management, and things along those lines. The National Guard space units are now caught between these two services, or, for lack of a better way of saying it, two different bosses, each with their own model of how to organize, train, and equip their members. So our commanders are left with the decision on who do they follow. Do they follow the service that they report their readiness to, or the service whose capabilities they present to our Joint Force commanders? Bottom line is the status quo is creating a disconnect between training, readiness, and force presentation at this time.
And also, I'll just add one other thing is that when you're dealing with deployed forces, such as the electronic warfare units, the Air Force and the Space Force have two different deployment models that they're working on right now. And so I'm sure that we'll probably hear about that from our Florida guest later on.
Okay, Mike, can you clarify for us what you mean by disconnected? Is this something that is a big deal or just something that can be worked around?
It is a big deal. Since December 2019, as Chris talked about earlier, when the U.S. Space Force was established, those Air National Guard units tasked with space missions have found ways to work around the disconnects, but unfortunately that gap continues to widen. Just one example is recently U.S. Space Force is finishing, they're in their final stages now, of developing a Space Force input tool into the Department of Defense's Defense Readiness Reporting System. This is the system that tracks the readiness of the units and the individuals. Because Space Force is developing their own, there's going to be a disconnect between the way Air Force and Space Force units present their forces and forces are generated. Just an offhand example, the Air National Guard has groups and wings, Space Force has deltas, so you're presenting units in a different way. For our folks individually, for them to be qualified to deploy, they must be fully trained in their occupational specialty, and Chris talked about this earlier. The 13 Sierra AFSC is going away, and all that training is now being provided by Space Force through Delta One. And of course, they are focused on Space Force members. So now we're competing for resources. And when we're competing for resources, our members are going to lose out on that.
All right, got it. So Scott, as someone who commands a deployable space electronic warfare squadron, do the same issues that Mike mentioned apply to your mission, or is it something that is only impacting a few Guard units?
Right. So what Colonel Bruno talked about, it obviously affects us as well, right? So that disconnected enterprise between Air National Guard, we fall under a fighter wing, and while we get great support, they're under ACC. You have the Delta 3 also involved, and then of course NGB. So I feel like we're kind of left out sometimes. This recently happened that we got the U.S. Space Force came down and did an inspection. And, obviously they're looking for things that we're just that disconnect culture right now. They've actually been inspected twice. They came down recently and then back in 2020 when they first stood up. One of the questions that came up was training specifically. And we actually produced some training products they took with them, but there's that disconnect. We're not sharing information, which I think Colonel Bruno touched on. To give a couple other examples, so we just recently had an enlisted member attend AIC, which is the instructor course for enlisted at weapons school. So here is the first ever Air National Guard enlisted member attend weapons school, but it's in a space course and really not recognized as an airman, right? He's kind of put into that guardian mindset. So does he ever have the buy-in that everyone else has? And I think that's a tough one. It was tough for him to get in. And then obviously, as far as what the future looks like for him. So other disconnects, I think we're already talked about. Obviously, from a unit commander, I'm looking at my people. How do I keep them engaged? One of the big part is what's the uncertainty, right? When you talk about readiness, I like to promote here. I'm always recruiting. You're always looking at folks. But with no Space Guard, what does that look like? What's the future look like for folks? And part of the model they talked about was, which I've seen stuff that if there's no Space Guard, then I want the Air National Guard to do the mission for the next 3 to 5 years. I'm not sure how we do that. You touched on some other topics. Look at the experience. We looked and polled our folks. So you got anywhere from 7 to 10 years experience. We've been around since 2014, us in California with the first two electromagnetic warfare units to kind of stand up. And you're taking away all that experience. And I don't know when you talk about everything else, how you kind of replace that quickly. We got a good mix. You have some folks like myself who've been actually in the Guard all my career, and then you have some active duty folks. We had actually a speechwriter for General Raymond come over to us recently with obviously some active duty space control experience. So you have a good mix, and I think that kind of stuff really helps when you're talking about readiness. And that's what I worry about. If it doesn't happen, what? I've not seen anything in this part-time force as to what that truly entails. Is it the same where we talk about folks that are able to do both? We have a good mix of our part-time folks working in the industry. And I think it was touched on, we did a poll. So we have 40% of our members working in the aerospace industry, whether that's SpaceX, Northrop Grumman, L3Harris, name a few. But you got that experience where you can leverage both. They can have that career in the military, but also leverage their civilian experience. And as far as I know, innovation doesn't necessarily happen in the military. Maybe it does at some point, but I think leveraging that, I think, is huge. So
yeah, and I'll also mention that as you mentioned, that experience of 7 to 10 years, the current plan from the Biden administration has been, and also especially through their Office of Management and Budget, is to replace or to remove the space units from the Air National Guard completely over the next few years. As it was mentioned in a recent Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, I think about a month ago. And if you take all these people out of the space mission, that will incur a huge cost to the Space Force, not only from equipment maintenance, organized training equipment, but you're going to have to figure out a way to get people that they don't have. They're already restrained by billet numbers in the Space Force. This was, as I mentioned earlier, this was a way to get more people, with experience capable of being leveraged in a crisis or in current operations. And that's going to take 7 to 10 years to get that experience base up that you're not going to have. And so all these other people that are now trained in space, as he mentioned, of that one enlisted troop that went to AIC, where are they going to go? And that's a concern that a lot of people are having with recruiting and retention, is they're going to have to be retrained in the Air Guard. And that means the Air Force is going to have to figure out what to do with these people. And that's going to be a bill for them as well. So this is not just these units have issues that they have to address. If this Space National Guard thing doesn't happen, it's going to be an issue that the Air Force is going to have to deal with as well.
I could touch on one more thing. You mentioned I was a deployable unit. This will be our 4th deployment coming up. I've been on one myself, and it's never been easy getting out the door when it comes to being kind of disconnected. And I think that's important to remember. So not being part of Space Force and how that works, it's been kind of a disconnect getting out the door.
Yeah, it's massively interesting. Now, Chris, I want to switch back to you to get to the root of this disconnection issue. As someone who has been following this debate about the Space National Guard since you were in the Pentagon working space policy, why do you think things are so disconnected? I mean, it clearly has negative impacts on the mission needs for our combatant commanders. So what are the dynamics that are behind this push to remove the National Guard from the space mission?
Well, that's a good question. And as you mentioned, that these units are not just here to support the Space Force. They support, such as the Florida mission, the Space Control mission, who's deploying a lot, they support combatant commanders worldwide. So it's not just that they're all connected into U.S. Space Command alone. They're supporting everything from operations in the Middle East to other places. And so all those combatant commanders are going to have issues finding out where they're going to get replacements for that too. But to your question, why is it so disconnected? I guess the only way I can probably describe that is the Pentagon and the DC world, as many of you, our listeners, know, is a lot about personality and a lot about experiences that people have with different organizations over time. And so in the case of 2019 to now, there have been at least 3 studies done within the Department of Defense and the Department of the Air Force on reserve components and the National Guard in particular. And there are just a lot of people that just have different views and different agendas on what they think is required and not required. So there are always these questions that pop up, like, why do states need space missions? Why does a governor need to have a electronic warfare space unit or a endurable, survivable strategic missile warning unit, to just name a few? And those questions really are the wrong questions to ask, because, you could ask the same thing about the Air National Guard. And so the Air National Guard has been proven to be a great model. The total force model has been proven since 9/11 to be a very, very important and useful model to be able to meet all of our requirements in a budget-constrained environment. And so because you have different people that, for whatever reason, have some antibodies toward the National Guard, they want to see that removed. The other part is that the National Guard operates under two codes of the United States Code. You have Title 10, which is the Federal Department of Defense warfighting code that governs all those activities, and you have Title 32, which is considered by many to be a training code within U.S. code, but it's also gives flexibility to federal people and state people to be able to use these National Guardsmen for various national security or homeland defense related missions. And so while myself and people in the Guard usually argue that this is a plus, when a commander in Title 10 does not have these units attached to them for operational reasons, in a deployed or whatever, they fall under the control of the governors, not the president and not the secretary and not whatever the deployed delta is that they're attached to. And so a lot of folks at the combatant command levels and in other parts of the services don't like the fact that they don't have day-to-day control over these units. And so there was a push for the single component idea that started about 2020, which is basically there is no reserve, there is no Guard, there's just a part-time and full-time Space Force, which has never been done in the United States. It's loosely based on an Australian Defense Force model, which, by the way, a lot of Australians don't think that it's really a great model in many cases when we did some studies on that back when I was doing space policy stuff. And so as a result of that, it's just a matter of trying to convince people that may not have been paying attention to what the Guard has been doing since the early 90s and how important they are and what the value added is. And so now we've just had to continue to make that argument, and the National Guard has had to continue to make that argument. And so that's why you see so much disconnectedness. And a lot of people, it's very politically sensitive with 54 states and territories, and there's concerns that people want that every state wants to have a space mission. And from what the National Guard Bureau has stated over and over again, and the Space Force that supported it has stated, is that that's not the plan. But even if there was to be growth in the future, that's up to the Secretary of the Air Force that runs all the basing and all the growth stuff. So it's not something the Guard can just do. A state can't just say, we're going to have a space unit. It's a federally created thing that the states then join in and support. So there's a lot of layers to this, but basically, podcasts like these and other events in the public over the last few years, I think have been necessary to kind of re-educate folks on what the Guard does in space, why it's important to not just the states, but also to the nation as a whole, because of space being a true warfighting domain.
The only thing I really have to add about this is there's a lot of opposition out there to the establishment of a Space National Guard, and a lot of that is based on an inaccurate Congressional Budget Office report that came out in about June of 2020, where it estimated that it would cost between $100 and $900 million to establish a Space National Guard. They talked about going across the 54 states and territories. They talked about building new headquarters. They talked about standing up a new command element back at Guard Bureau. And none of that is actually required. The actual cost, and this has come out from the Air National Guard previously, or the National Guard, is somewhere in the ballpark of $250,000. And there's no budget increase required. That will be money that will come out of the National Guard itself. And that money will be used to change name tapes and change heraldry. So guidons, signs outside of buildings, things along those lines. So the members of the 233rd, the ones that are doing this Space and Missile Warning mission, they will come in one day, if a Space National Guard is established, into the same building, using the same equipment, wearing the same uniform with new name tape colors on it. That is the cost. There is no added cost to bring in new people, bring in new equipment, build new buildings. So that's my input on that one. Thank you.
And I'll also add that in addition to those new name tags, it's not just new name tags, it's clear, organized, train, and equip lines between the Space Force and those Guard units and the National Guard Bureau. So while it is aesthetically the same thing, that's a huge change when you have the ability to know where your funding's coming from, you have access to training, and you're not competing for resources as the folks mentioned earlier.
Okay, so Mike and Scott, I know we briefly went over the mission sets, but can you share with our listeners how your respective space missions contribute to our national defense? Listening to some of the commentary out there, it sounds like the Space Force is sort of a service provider for the other branches of the military, but given the threats by China and Russia in space, is that really the case?
So I think it's important for the listener to understand that 60% of the space electromagnetic warfare units are currently in the Air National Guard. And of course, the U.S. Space Force has said they can't do the mission without us. I've heard it numerous times. I've been at conferences. We can't do it without the Guard, yet the mantra is that we don't want the Guard. So it's kind of hard from my perspective. We were established, obviously, back in 2014 to actually build capacity for the U.S. Space Force, especially the EW, electromagnetic warfare. So obviously, we're deployed across the globe to meet the combatant command requirements. I kind of mentioned just from us, we've had deployments, obviously going back since 2018. The Guard actually stood up California and Colorado to take 100% of the mission at the time from the active duty so they could train and equip on a new system. Space to war fighting domain is critical to our way of life. And I think it's important to remember that that's what we're here to do. And I think from our mission set, I think the Guard provides that. And I think that's what's missing. And just to go back to the last question, I think what's not mentioned in cost is experience. We kind of touched on it earlier, but when you think of 7 to 10 years to get that experience back, are we willing to push that off on what's happening in the world today when we're talking about China and Russia? I don't know, as an American, I want to push that experience away. So that's just my perspective.
Yeah, and I'll also mention that mission that they operate down in Florida is what's called the counter communication system, and it's essentially a jamming system. And when you look at what the Chinese and Russians are doing, building their multi-layered attack architectures, they call it, to include options across what's known as the counter space continuum, where you have reversible impacts such as jamming and directed energy and things of that sort, like lasers and high-powered microwaves and all that kind of stuff, all the way up to kinetic interceptors that we've seen tested, with Russia recently testing one last November, December timeframe, where they actually kinetically blow stuff up in space. And so as a result of that, it's also to be told that the Space Force put all these extra units in there because they need more capacity. And I would argue that we still need more capacity in that mission area, as well as other areas like the orbital warfare area, which is just starting out now with Delta 9. And there's lots of ways that the Guard could support that in the future, given the budget constraints and the limitation on how many people are allowed in the Space Force, the active part, levied by Congress.
So if I can answer actually your question there, that are they just a service provider? No. Space has become a warfighting domain, just like land, sea, and air. And we do need folks that are ready to defend and support that domain. And that's what Space Force is for. So it is more than just a service provider. And I think tagging on with what both Chris and Scott said, with the threat from China and Russia, we've seen how important it is to have a position in space where we can provide support, security, and strategic effects from space, because that's what Russia and China are doing. As for the missions, recently, when Russia decided to invade Ukraine, the men and women of the 233rd Space Group, specifically the 137th Space Warning Squadron, were activated, again, as the only mobile and endurable space and missile warning mission, just in case there were missile launches that were outside the effects of Ukraine, our folks would be able to detect those. So it is a vital mission to our nation's defense, and it was just another example of how important it is that we have this mission.
All right, thanks for that. Okay, so we know the larger problem, but what can we do about it?
Well, I'll start with that. The only way that this can be fixed, really, the easiest route, and 3 studies in the department have pretty much stated this, and I'll mention also that in that SASC, that's Senate Armed Services Committee hearing from a month or 2 ago, that mentioned the Office of Management and Budget directing the push out all the Guard units and to not establish a Space Guard per the studies, is that none of these studies ever made it to Congress. And so a lot of these congressmen and senators that have been mandating these in National Defense Authorization Acts for the last several years have never received these reports. And as a result of that, that the National Guard Bureau and others have been trying to educate the members of Congress from each of the states that hold space missions in the Guard, but also all the others that have equity in national defense, which is just about everybody, on what the Guard does and has done and could do continually into the future. And as a result of that, the administration, when they put out their Statement of Administration Policy, that's basically just their view of congressional bills. Last NDAA, they decided to extend that to the fiscal year 23, which is now being marked up right now in Congress, to basically say that we don't want one, we don't need one, and we want to get rid of these missions in the next few years. Even if they decided they wanted to keep the status quo, it's still not good for our nation's defense or for these personnel in order to maintain their readiness to do what we need to do in a situation where Putin has been rattling his nuclear saber, has been engaging counter space operations overseas, and the Chinese obviously are building up and testing their own capabilities. It's not really a good time to do anything super drastic like that. And frankly, what needs to happen is the Congress needs to establish the Space National Guard, which, as Colonel Bruno mentioned, is really just acknowledging an institution that already exists. It just needs to be recognized as such. The units are already there, the people are already there, the weapon systems are already there. They just need to be properly aligned with the leadership chain in the Space Force, and they need to be properly aligned in the funding, organized training, and equipping of functions.
Well, first of all, that was well said. So what we do need right now is we need our representatives to, both on the House and the Senate side, to introduce language establishing the Space National Guard. Currently, the Office of Management and Budget has a gag order out where the services can't speak about the Space National Guard. They're not allowed to bring it up. They're not allowed to support it. So what we need is our congressional delegates to go out there and say this is the right thing for America. It's the right thing to save the American taxpayers' money. It's the right thing to make sure that we don't have a degradation in the readiness of our space missions over the next 7 to 10 years. If you look at the outlook of where China and Russia plan to be in the next 7 to 10 years, it's vitally important for our nation's security that we maintain our readiness when it comes to space operations. So that's what we're looking for right now is our congressional delegates to submit the language. It's that easy.
So, Chris, you mentioned what the administration says they're considering. What are the pros and cons of that vision?
Well, I think we've discussed that somewhat, but let me just give it a little more context behind that. So, as I mentioned, the Statement of Administration Policy is their statement out in public that they don't want a Space National Guard. They don't think it's necessary, and this is widely held throughout most of the administration in the White House, at least. And as the Colonel mentioned, there is a gag order that the Chief of the Guard Bureau and other senior federal Title X military leaders are not able to advocate for it or speak to it or any of that stuff. So that's why we're hearing mostly from the state leaderships, the adjutants generals, and the local unit people. And in their mind, the positive is, as I mentioned earlier, Title X control of space and no access for Title 32 because they don't see the value added in Title 32. Let me give you a quick insight into how Title 32 could be used because I didn't bring that up earlier, and I think that might be useful context for folks listening. Title 32 allows us to the Guard and the Space Force with the Guard to be able to do operations short of commanding satellites or conducting maneuvers or shooting electronic, trons, if you will, with jamming. So it has been proposed back when U.S. Space Command was created, which is the combatant command piece of it. Space Force is the organized, train, and equip side, obviously, that rather than spending all that money from Title X pots of money, that states such as California, which has a satellite command and control mission, or Alaska, which has a missile warning and space surveillance 24/7 mission set, that rather than having to put folks on Title 10 orders for doing 99% of their function of monitoring status of the systems in space or tracking things moving around in space, that they could do a similar thing like the fighter planes do with the Sovereignty Alert or Homeland Defense mission, which is where they're on alert, ready to do the mission with the airplanes, and then they're called up, they're scrambled, and they launch, and then once the wheels are up, they automatically convert to a Title 10 status per prearranged structure, order structure. And that has been promoted within the Department of Defense around the same time frame as these studies have been, as a way to have greater cost reduction and allow more mission to be done by the Guard at lower rates. So if there is a need for a protect and defend action, then those crews on console can then transition up to Title 10 with what's called auto conversion. That hasn't been agreed upon, but that's one way you could leverage that. Additionally, these space operators have knowledge that can be leveraged by state leadership to do homeland missions such as domestic response for emergencies like earthquakes, tornadoes, fires, terrorist attack, things of that sort. That hasn't really been explored too much by states, although some states are getting into the use of overhead satellite imagery for their disaster response. And a lot of that is done with Guard units in other states as well, and those experience spaces can be really useful, and I've seen that on my Guard side of life back several years ago. So their pluses really are not that great because you're losing a lot of experience and capability and options and flexibility that you get with Title 32 and Title 10, as well as those folks that work, special missions with the NRO that can govern under Title 50. But for whatever reason, they think it's better to just have that control rather than having in their minds, a bifurcated chain of command, if you will, under the governors until they're activated. The other thing I will mention that's a pro that for whatever reason they don't see is the fact that with a very small amount of the American population serving in uniform, that having a local community-based unit like the Guard provides all over the country in air and land, and now with these 7 states plus 1 territory with space, the Space Force, if they really want to get their understanding of what they do out there, what better way than to leverage their neighbors in these states to explain what the Space Force does? Because not every state has a Space Force base. Those are very far and few between. But there are other states that the Guard has space missions in that these folks could be sort of emissaries for that. And then lastly, I'll mention another pro that they leave out that we've seen prove fruitful in places like Brazil and even in Ukraine is the State Partnership Program, which is a Guard-led program with various foreign countries and foreign militaries that allows us to give them training and experience in everything from air, land, and even space. The unit that I've been affiliated with has been working with Brazil as sort of a means of helping to counter a lot of what the Chinese and Russians have been trying to gain within burgeoning space-powered nations like Brazil. And so I think those are value-added areas that, for whatever reason, the White House folks don't see the importance of, despite all the good things we're seeing helping the Ukrainians because of previous engagements in that area.
I was just going to add, when you referenced the State Partnership Program, obviously Space Command is currently vetting other countries as space capabilities during this time. And this is a perfect time to leverage the expertise in the Guard, especially as we look ahead. So I think that's a perfect example of how you can use the Guard for that relationship and the ability to leverage capabilities.
And so I understand that people want to give the administration's view, there are some pros in some people's minds, but I really think the cons really outweigh the pros in this respect, but I'll just leave it at that for now.
So are we seeing anything out of Congress that might see this issue differently? We've got language introduced recently focusing on this issue. So any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll start with that one also. The Congress, last we heard, the last couple of years, the House Armed Services Committee has had language to establish a Space Guard. Because of all the other stuff going on over the last couple of years, the National Defense Authorization Act has been very late. And as such, when they get to conference, which is where both houses get together to figure out what to unify to have a unified bill to send the president, they've had to cut a lot of stuff out just to get it through at the 11th hour. So that has always been one of those things that has been punted in lieu of another study, which, as I mentioned, none of the studies have ever made it to Congress because they've been held up at the White House level for various reasons. And so now the word is, as the House is marking up their Authorization Act, that Congressman Crow from Colorado is supposed to be putting the language back in again. We'll likely possibly see that on the 22nd of June when they have their full-up committee hearing. The Senate, Dianne Feinstein from California and Marco Rubio from Florida, have also put in similar language to match the House language as a standalone bill in the Senate. Both of those members are not on the Armed Services Committee, but they're in the appropriations side. And so there are ways that the appropriators could put things in that the authorizers don't. However, most likely we'll see another co-sponsor of that bill bring that to the Senate Armed Services Committee, which has been having all their markups in the last week or so in closed-door sessions. And so we won't hear what happens with that until probably the next week or two. But hopefully we'll see that as an amendment to the process. But it all depends on the leaders and the bill managers to see if this will ever become part of the bill. And we'll have to just see what happens with the leaders, Adam Smith and Mike Rogers in the House Armed Services Committee, and the other two, Inhofe and Jack Reed on the Democrat side. Both of them need to see this as what it is, as a critical need for the country and not just something that the Guard wants to have because it's just for Guard's sake. That's not at all what the Guard is arguing for. And it's not at all what the Air Force and the Space Force were arguing for over the last 3 years. This is vitally important to keep the capabilities and the capacity that we need, and especially with what's going on in space right now.
All right, gentlemen, we are running a little long on time as we do on the Aerospace Advantage. Does anybody have any saved rounds?
Hey, this is Col Michael Bruno. Not really a saved round, but I just want to thank you, and thanks for this opportunity to get our message out. I think it's critically important for your listeners to understand that the establishment of the Space National Guard is not only good for our country, especially in this contested environment with both China and Russia, but it's also a cost savings to our taxpayers. So $250,000 is the estimate to actually establish a Space National Guard. And if we follow what OMB policy right now is to move the missions out of the Space National Guard and into U.S. Space Force, it's going to cost the taxpayers somewhere estimated around $600 to $800 million to transfer the missions, build new buildings, train and equip new Guardians. And we're going to have about a 7 to 10 year lag in our readiness in protecting our great country. So that's all I have at this time, but thank you very much.
Lieutenant Colonel McGuire?
Well, thanks for having me. It's definitely my pleasure. 30 years in the Florida National Guard. Looking forward to the possibility of a Space National Guard. I think we need the capability, and it is definitely the most cost-effective way to maintain a space power advantage.
Well, it sounds like we still may have some work to do on this front, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Mike, Scott, and Chris, for sharing your thoughts and being here with us today.
Hey, Slick. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Slick. I appreciate the opportunity as well.
Always a pleasure. Thanks very much.
With that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's discussion. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to our listeners for your continued support and for tuning in to today's show. If you like what you've heard today, don't forget to hit that like button and follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas you think we should explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Stay safe and check 6.